50 years. For 50 years, my family has lived in the silence left behind by a sky-blue sedan that drove off on a sunny afternoon and vanished from the face of the earth. It has been 50 years since my Aunt Eleanor and Uncle James went on their honeymoon and never came home. Their disappearance is the first story I ever learned, a foundational myth whispered in hushed tones, a ghost story where the ghosts share my blood. And it always begins in the same place, with the photograph on my mother's mantelpiece, the very spot where I am standing now. It sits in a tarnished silver frame, a captured moment of joy that has outlasted everyone's hope. The air in the house is heavy, thick with the cloying scent of dust, lemon polish, and something deeper, like sorrow that has seeped into the wallpaper. I lean closer to the glass, my breath fogging a small circle. I've studied their faces so many times, I feel like I should know them. James has his arm wrapped securely around Eleanor, a gesture that is both loving and protective. His smile is easy and confident, but I've often wondered about his eyes. They seem to hold a universe of plans, of certainty about the future. Eleanor is tilted back in a full-throated laugh, a laugh my mother says could make chandeliers tremble. She's wearing a simple lace dress, and her short veil is being teased by a gentle breeze I can almost feel on my own skin. They are beautiful, they are in love, and they are forever trapped in the amber of that single perfect day. This photograph is my only inheritance from them. It is not a memory, but a mystery, a two-dimensional clue I have spent my entire life trying to solve. Their story, as my mother told it in fragmented pieces over the years, was a fairy tale. They met at a local dance, and James, who was usually so reserved, walked straight across the room and asked her to dance before anyone else could. He said he knew from the first moment. My mother told me once that he proposed at a scenic overlook, the very kind of place they would later seek out on their final journey. He didn't have a ring, just a wildflower he'd picked, which he tied around her finger. Eleanor was the dreamer who painted watercolors of mundane things and made them beautiful. James was the kind, steady accountant who built the frame for her dreams. Their wedding was a simple backyard affair, but to hear my mother describe it, it was the social event of the season, filled with the scent of my grandmother's prize-winning roses and the sound of a small band playing under a string of lights. They were the promise of a good life, a tangible piece of evidence that happy endings were real. Their honeymoon was meant to be their first great adventure. The new sky-blue sedan was their chariot, polished to a gleam. They had a map with a route drawn in red ink, a winding path through the heart of the American West. They were chasing the horizon, seeking out the vast, majestic national parks. The last sign of life was a postcard. It showed a giant redwood, a titan of the natural world, and on the back, Eleanor's looping cursive was a burst of youthful optimism. A month passed. The calendar page was turned. In our house, hope began to curdle into anxiety. My mother described the agonizing ritual of waiting. The family huddled by the rotary phone, jumping at every ring, only for it to be a neighbor or a wrong number. The daily walk to the mailbox shifted from hopeful expectation to a dreaded chore, its empty metal mouth, a daily confirmation of their silence. The silence itself became a presence in the house, a creeping dread that stole the light from the rooms and etched permanent lines of worry onto my grandparents' faces. Police searches were launched, then scaled back, then finally abandoned. Their car, a conspicuous vessel of blue steel and chrome, had seemingly been swallowed by the landscape. They had driven straight into a void. I was born a decade later into this quiet, suffocating aftermath. I did not inherit my aunt's artistic talent or my uncle's easy smile. I inherited their absence. My childhood was spent navigating the geography of my mother's grief. I have a distinct memory of being 6 years old, tiptoeing into the attic because I heard a sound. I found my mother sitting on a dusty trunk, the single attic bulb illuminating the tears on her cheeks. She was holding Eleanor's wedding veil, the delicate fabric looking like captured moonlight in her. trembling hands. She didn't know I was there. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding, understanding for the first time that the people in the photograph were not just a story, they were a wound. My pain was not born from loss, but from the shadow of it. It was a second-hand sorrow, a constant dull ache for the hole they had left in my mother's heart, a hole that I, her daughter, could never fill. Looking at the photograph now, I feel the familiar weight of it all descend. It's the prologue to the story that has defined me, a beautiful before that makes the 50 years of after so much more tragic. It is the reason I am standing in this silent house today, surrounded by the ghosts of a life that was never lived, tasked with packing away the memories of people I never got to make memories with. It is the beginning of a mystery that I am afraid will die with my mother, unless I can finally, after all this time, find an answer. The official investigation was a masterclass in futility, a slow-motion collapse of hope. Standing here in my mother's living room, surrounded by the quiet evidence of its failure, I can almost feel the phantom echo of those frantic early days. The police, working with the limited tools of the early 1970s, were chasing shadows from the start. They had no crime scene, no ransom note, no body. All they had was a single postcard and a vast, indifferent American landscape that was notoriously good at keeping secrets. I've read the case file so many times the pages are soft and frayed at the edges. It's a thin folder for a 50-year mystery filled with dead ends and the ghosts of unanswered questions. Search parties were organized. Black and white photos in the local newspaper show grim-faced men in flannel shirts and state troopers with weary eyes fanning out into the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. They look so small against the towering trees. For weeks they scoured ravines, dragged rivers, and peered over cliffs, looking for any sign, a piece of twisted metal, a scrap of fabric, a glint of chrome. They found nothing. The blue sedan, my mother's most tangible symbol of their disappearance, had vanished as completely as if it had been spirited into the sky. Investigators interviewed everyone they could find along the couple's planned route, tired motel clerks who barely remembered their faces, gas station attendants who saw a dozen young couples a day, a waitress who thought she might have served them pie, but couldn't be sure. Each interview was another brick in a wall of uncertainty. With no evidence of foul play, the official theory settled into a neat, plausible, and utterly unbearable conclusion. It was a tragic accident. This became the official story, the one the lead detective, a man with a kind but tired voice, repeated to my grandparents every time they called. He'd talk about treacherous mountain roads, the possibility of falling asleep at the wheel, of a single moment of distraction, leading their car into a canyon so deep and overgrown it might never be found. The explanation was meant to be comforting, a way to file the tragedy away under act of God. But for my family, it was a torment. It offered no closure, no one to blame, and left the door agonizingly ajar for impossible hope. An accident meant they were gone, but the lack of a car meant maybe they weren't. The public, of course, had other ideas, more sinister and imaginative. In the absence of facts, local folklore bloomed. Whispers circulated in diners and barbershops. Maybe they had run into a bad crowd, a group of drifters preying on unsuspecting tourists. This was the era of Manson, and tales of nomadic cults in the wilderness were terrifyingly believable. Others wondered if they had simply run away. Had James been in some kind of trouble? Was Eleanor secretly unhappy? These theories, born of boredom and a morbid curiosity, were like salt in the wound for my family. They painted my aunt and uncle as reckless or deceitful, tarnishing the perfect memory my mother clung to so desperately. And so, my mother became the sole keeper of the flame, the self-appointed chief investigator of a case the world had forgotten. This house, the one I am now tasked with dismantling, became her headquarters. It's not a home, it's an archive of sorrow. In the spare room, which was once Eleanor's, she assembled the case. Filing cabinets groan with binders. One is filled with yellowed newspaper. Clippings, the paper so brittle it flakes like dry leaves when touched. Another contains maps of national parks crisscrossed with lines in red, blue, and black ink, marking search areas, possible detours, and unconfirmed sightings. My mother spent her nights writing letters to police chiefs, to park rangers, to private investigators, to anyone who would listen. Most went unanswered. Living here was like living with a ghost. The unresolved mystery was a constant presence, shaping the rhythm of our days. Anniversaries were the worst. Every year, on the date they disappeared, my mother would retreat into a profound silence, sitting in Eleanor's room for hours, just staring at the watercolor paintings still leaning against the wall. She refused to change a thing in that room. The bedspread is the same one from 1969. A bottle of perfume still sits on the dresser, its scent long since evaporated. It was her way of keeping them close, of refusing to let the world move on. But in doing so, she trapped herself in the past, and me along with her. For me, there was no escaping the weight of what was lost, because here, in this house, nothing was ever truly gone. It was just missing. The decision to clean out the house wasn't made lightly. It was a surrender. For the last 6 months, my mother has been living in the sterile, quiet world of a long-term care facility. Her mind, once a fortress of sharp memories and fierce hope, has begun to betray her. Dementia is a cruel thief, stealing memories not all at once, but one by one, like a person plucking books from a library until only the empty shelves remain. The task of dismantling her home, this monument to my aunt and uncle, fell to me. And so here I am, standing in the living room surrounded by cardboard boxes and 50 years of accumulated life, feeling less like a daughter and more like an archaeologist excavating a tomb. On top of a stack of old magazines sits the most recent addition to my mother's collection. It's an article from the local paper, published just last month on the 50th anniversary of the disappearance. I pick it up, the paper still crisp. The headline reads, 50 years later, golden couple's disappearance remains town's enduring mystery. The article rehashes the old story, quoting the same tired theories and painting Eleanor and James as tragic, romantic figures from a bygone era. For the town, it's a piece of folklore. For my mother, it was a fresh wound. The nurses at the facility told me she'd clutched this newspaper for a week straight, her knuckles white, her eyes lost in a past I could only imagine. That's the reason I'm finally here, surrounded by these ghosts. The real catalyst wasn't the anniversary itself, but a visit I made to my mother a few weeks ago. I found her sitting by the window in her small antiseptic room. The air smelled of lavender air freshener and bleach. She was looking out at the manicured lawn, but her eyes were seeing something else. Entirely. When I took her hand, it felt as fragile as a bird's wing. She turned to me, and for a moment her gaze was clear, the fog of her confusion momentarily lifted. But she wasn't looking at me, Sarah. Her eyes were seeing a face from 50 years ago. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of sound. She squeezed my hand, a flicker of desperate strength in her grip. "You came back. Oh, Eleanor, I was so worried. Where have you been?" My heart fractured. It had happened before. These slips in time, but never with such painful certainty. I didn't know what to do. The nurses had told me to gently correct her, but looking into her pleading, hopeful eyes, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I couldn't be the one to make my aunt disappear all over again. So I just held her hand and said, "I'm here now." The relief that washed over her face was a beautiful, devastating thing. For 10 minutes, I was not her daughter, the one who had grown up in the shadow of her grief. I was her sister, the one who had caused it. That visit changed everything. The vague, historical sadness I had always carried sharpened into a desperate, immediate need. I had to find an answer, not for the history books or for myself, but for the fading memory of a woman who deserved some peace. That is the energy I carry with me now as I move through the silent rooms. Every object I touch is imbued with a double meaning, its own history, and the history of my mother's obsession with it. I open a hall closet and find winter coats that haven't been worn in a decade, and tucked inside the pocket of one is a faded receipt from a private investigator my mother hired in the 90s. In the kitchen, behind the recipe books, is a list of license plates from an old witness statement. The house is a labyrinth of grief, and my job is to untangle it. The job is exhausting, physically and emotionally. Days are spent sorting, boxing, and throwing away the mundane detritus of a life. But one area remains, the attic. It's the final frontier of the house, the place where the oldest and most sacred relics are stored. It's where my grandfather kept his things, and where my mother stored the deepest, most untouched parts of Eleanor's memory. I know it's the last place I have to face. Standing at the bottom of the pull-down ladder, I take a deep breath. The air that drifts down smells of cedar, dust, and time itself. I feel a strange pull, a sense that this final, dreaded task is the one that matters most. With a new and pressing sense of purpose, I begin to climb. The air in the attic is heavy and hot, smelling of ancient wood, dried-out paper, and the ghosts of forgotten things. A single bare bulb hangs from a rafter, casting long, dancing shadows that make the piles of discarded life look like slumbering beasts. Every creak of the floorboards under my feet sounds like a protest against my intrusion. I move slowly, methodically, overwhelmed by the scale of the task. This is the attic of a woman who never threw anything away, who believed every object held a piece of a soul. There are stacks of my old school projects, boxes of Christmas ornaments that haven't seen a tree in decades, and my father's old army uniform, neatly folded in a cedar chest. For hours, I work in a state of dusty, sweat-soaked monotony, my mind numb. It is a slow, sad excavation of a family's history. In the far corner, tucked under the eaves, sits my grandfather's large steamer trunk. It's covered in a thick film of dust, and the leather straps are cracked with age. I have to put my whole body into it to drag it into the weak light of the single bulb. The brass latches groan as I force them open. This was his memory box. Inside are the relics of his life before he was a father, before the tragedy. I see his war medals, a faded photograph of his platoon, his high school diploma, and bundles of letters tied with string, written in my grandmother's elegant hand. I handle them gently, feeling like a voyeur. This is not my history, but I am its last custodian. My fingers dig deeper, past old report cards and a baby book. I am not looking for anything in particular, just fulfilling my duty to see, to touch, to acknowledge, before it all gets packed away. That's when I feel it. At the very bottom of the trunk, my fingers brush against something cold, round and metallic. I pull it out. It's a small, flat can about 7 inches in diameter, an 8mm film reel. The silver of the can is tarnished, and on a faded piece of yellowed tape, a label is written in my grandmother's familiar cursive, Christmas 65. A wave of bittersweet curiosity washes over me. Christmas 1965. I'd be born in another 15 years. My mother would have been a teenager, a home movie. A glimpse of my family whole and happy before the great fracture. A moment of light in this dusty, oppressive place. The idea of watching it feels like a small act of defiance against the sadness of my task. Finding a working projector takes 2 days. I eventually track one down at a vintage electronics shop downtown, a heavy beige machine that the owner assures me still runs. Back at the house, I set it up on a coffee table in the living room, threading the brittle-looking film through the sprockets and pointing the lens at a bare white wall. The room is dark except for the glow of the machine. With a flick of a switch, the projector whirs to life, its fan humming, the air filling with a distinct smell of hot metal and burning dust. A bright empty square of light flickers on the wall, and then the images appear. It's not Christmas. There are no trees, no presents. The footage is silent, grainy, and washed in the vibrant, oversaturated colors of old film. A young, smiling Eleanor, her hair tied in a scarf, waves at the camera. Then, a shaky shot of a breathtaking mountain vista. It's them. It's the honeymoon. My heart catches in my throat. I see James, impossibly young, skipping a stone across a pristine alpine lake. I see Eleanor leaning against their sky-blue sedan at a scenic turnout, the wind whipping through her hair. It's beautiful and achingly sad. I am watching ghosts, happy and alive, completely unaware of the fate that awaits them just outside the frame. I feel a tear slide down my cheek, a strange mix of joy and grief. Then the scene changes. The camera is steady now, placed on a rock or a ledge, pointing toward a cliffside overlook. Eleanor and James are in the frame, their backs to a stunning canyon, and then a third person walks into the shot. A man. He's tall, wearing a dark suit that seems out of place in the rustic setting. He seems to know them. He smiles and shakes James's hand. For a moment they talk, their body language easy. But the mood shifts. The man's gestures become sharper. He takes a step closer to James, who instinctively puts a protective arm in front of Eleanor. There is no sound, but I can read the violence in their movements. It's an argument, fierce and sudden. My body goes rigid. I lean forward, my hands gripping the edge of the table. It happens in a flash. The man lunges, not at Eleanor, but at James. It's a blur of motion, a dark suit, a desperate defense. The camera is jostled. The image tilts wildly, capturing a patch of sky, a frantic leg, and then nothing. The film runs out, flapping against the reel, and the screen turns to a blinding, flickering white. The projector continues to whir in the dead silence of the room. I sit there, frozen, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The darkness of the room feels absolute, the silence deafening. I have just become the sole witness to a 50-year-old crime. The whirring of the projector was the only sound in the world. For how long I sat there staring at the flickering white void on the wall, I don't know. Time had ceased to exist. There was only the before, the grainy, sun-drenched images of their life, and the violent, incomprehensible after. The shock that had frozen my muscles began to thaw, replaced by a white-hot surge of adrenaline. The grief I had carried my whole life, a passive, heavy weight, was now an active, burning thing. This was no longer a story about a disappearance. It was about a murder. And for the first time in 50 years, we had a face. My first call was not to the police, but to a digital media specialist, a man whose website promised miracles with outdated formats. I drove to his sterile downtown lab, clutching the film can like a holy relic. For 3 days, I paced my mother's house, waiting. When he finally called, his voice was clinical, but I could hear a trace of excitement. He had not only restored and digitized the footage, but he had also isolated several clear frames of the man's face. The email arrived a moment later, and there he was. No longer a blurry figure in a chaotic scene, but a person. His features were sharp, his expression a mask of cold fury. This image was the key. My next step was to find Detective Miller, the retired officer who had led the original investigation. It took some effort, but I found him living in a small house 2 towns over. He was an old man now, with the same kind eyes I remembered from my childhood, but they were clouded with the disappointment of a case that had haunted his career. I didn't offer pleasantries. I just opened my laptop on his kitchen table and played the video. He watched it once, his face impassive. He watched it a second time, leaning so close I could see the reflection of the screen in his glasses. When he finally looked up at me, the cloud had lifted. A spark I hadn't seen in 30 years had returned to his eyes. "My God," he whispered. "All this time." We turned my mother's house into a command center, spreading the contents of her sorrowful archive across the dining room table. We were no longer excavating a tomb, we were searching for a weapon. We spent hours poring over my mother's old photo albums, holding the printed still from the film next to the smiling faces at birthday parties and backyard barbecues. His face was nowhere. "He wasn't a close friend," Miller said, his finger tapping the photo. "Look at the suit. He's dressed for business." That's when I remembered the wedding guest list my mother had preserved in a plastic sleeve. We scanned the names, cross-referencing them with my grandfather's old business contacts. And then we saw it. Arthur Vance. Okay. former business partner, a name followed by a note in my mother's handwriting, argument with Dad, partnership dissolved, June 69, weeks before the wedding. Arthur Vance was not hard to find. He was a titan of industry now, the reclusive CEO of a successful manufacturing company, living in a glass-walled mansion in a neighboring state. Armed with the film Detective Miller's badge and 50 years of my family's pain, we drove to his fortress of solitude. A severe-looking assistant tried to turn us away, but Miller's quiet authority got us into a vast, minimalist living room that felt more like an art gallery than a home. Arthur Vance entered the room. He was frail, stooped with age, but his eyes were still sharp and cold. He was polite, arrogant, and utterly dismissive. He denied knowing Eleanor and James, denied ever being on their honeymoon, and threatened to call his lawyers. His composure was flawless, an impenetrable wall of wealth and time. Miller was about to speak again, but I couldn't wait. I stepped forward, my hand shaking as I held up my tablet. "Then who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling with a rage I didn't know I possessed. I pressed play. The silent, grainy film flickered to life in the pristine, modern room. Vance's eyes locked onto the screen. His practiced smile tightened. When the image of his younger self appeared, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor started in his hand. He watched the argument. He watched himself lunge at James. When the screen went white, he didn't speak. The mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated. The powerful CEO was gone, replaced by a guilty, withered old man. "The property," he finally rasped, his voice a ghost of what it had been. He wouldn't look at me, only at the floor. "The old timber property near the national park." He gave us the address, his confession a series of broken, whispered directions. Hours later, I stood in a field of overgrown weeds, watching a team of police officers use bolt cutters on the rusted chains of a barn that looked like it might collapse in the next strong wind. The air inside was thick and stale. They swept away dirt and debris from the far corner, revealing two large, flat steel doors set into the concrete floor, a hidden bunker. It took 4 officers to heave the doors open, a groan of tortured metal echoing in the cavernous space. They aimed their powerful flashlights down into the darkness. The beams cut through 50 years of blackness, and there it was. The unmistakable rounded shape of a sky-blue sedan covered in a shroud of rust and decay. As the light washed over the interior, it revealed the pale white of bone. The search was over. My aunt and uncle had finally been found. The hours that followed the discovery at the barn are a blur of flashing lights and quiet professional voices. I sat in Detective Miller's car, a coarse wool blanket draped over my shoulders, and watched as the scene was transformed. Forensic specialists in white. Suits moved with a somber, methodical grace, turning my family's 5-decade-old tragedy into a modern crime scene. They were no longer ghosts. They were evidence. Eleanor and James were finally being treated with the gravity and care they had been denied for so long. The truth was no longer a matter of memory and speculation. It was a physical reality being carefully documented under the cold glare of portable floodlights. The what had been answered, but the why remained a gaping wound. And there was only one person left who could explain it. The confession did not come in a torrent of guilt. It came in the sterile, soundproofed environment of a police interrogation room. I watched from behind a one-way mirror, Detective Miller standing silently beside me. Arthur Vance sat at a metal table, a cup of water untouched before him. He looked smaller now, stripped of the power of his mansion and his expensive suit. He was just an old man at the end of a very long lie. He began to speak, his voice low and raspy, not with remorse, but with the weariness of a man unburdening himself of a heavy, inconvenient secret. His story began not with murder, but with obsession. Through his confession, my narration would fill in the images he painted. He had known my mother's family for years, a business associate of my grandfather. He spoke of Eleanor with a chilling, proprietary reverence. He'd watched her grow up, convinced himself that her kindness toward him was a sign of a deeper affection. Her engagement to James was, in his mind, a personal betrayal. This unrequited love was twisted together with a more practical problem. He and my grandfather were engaged in a fraudulent land development scheme, and their partnership was built on a foundation of cooked books. James, the sharp young accountant, had been helping my grandfather organize his finances before the wedding. Vance was terrified that James, with his keen eye for numbers, had either found the fraud or would find it soon. He told us he followed them on their honeymoon, driving a day behind them, his mind a cauldron of jealousy and paranoia. He rented a different car, paid in cash, and planned to confront James under the guise of a friendly surprise. He finally caught up to them at that scenic overlook, the one immortalized on that terrible reel of film. Now, with his words filling in the silence, the scene played out in my mind with horrifying clarity. He approached them with a smile, but the friendly facade quickly crumbled. "We need to talk," Vance had said to James, ignoring Eleanor completely. The conversation, captured in frantic pantomime on the film, was about money, about falsified ledgers and phantom investors. "You're smart, James, too smart. I know you've seen the books," Vance spat. James, honest and unflinching, did not deny it. He had found inconsistencies and planned to advise my grandfather to report them. "You'll ruin me," Vance seethed. James stood his ground. "You? Ruin yourself, Arthur. It's over." That was the moment that sealed their fate. It was the lunge I had seen 100 times in my nightmares over the past few days. In his rage and desperation, Vance shoved James. The overlook was beautiful, but treacherous, with a steep, rocky drop-off partially hidden by brush. James stumbled backward, losing his footing on the loose gravel at the edge. He didn't even scream as he fell. It was that quick, that brutal, a life extinguished by a moment of pathetic, wounded pride. Eleanor's scream, however, echoed in Vance's memory and now in mine. She was the only witness. Her shock turned to terror as she looked at Vance, her childhood friend, and saw a monster. His mind, he said, went cold. There was no other choice. To let her live was to go to prison, to lose everything. What happened next, he described with a chilling detachment. He silenced her, his hands ensuring her scream was her last. The cover-up was frantic but methodical. He was on. His own property, a remote parcel of land he had bought for the fraudulent scheme. He knew no one would come looking there. Under the cover of darkness, he managed to get James's body up from the rocks below. He put them both in their car, the sky-blue sedan, and drove it to the old derelict barn. He opened the doors to the hidden bunker, a remnant from the property's previous paranoid owner, and rolled the car down into the darkness. He sealed the doors, scattered some debris over them, and walked away. He drove back to his life, sold his interest in the partnership, cut all ties with my family, and used his illicit gains to build his empire, a monument built on top of a grave. For 50 years, the secret held. He was haunted, he claimed, not by guilt, but by the constant, low-grade fear of discovery, a fear that had finally, today, come to pass. As his story ended, the room fell silent. He slumped in his chair, an empty husk. Behind the glass, I felt nothing but a cold, hollow certainty. The great mystery of my life wasn't a legend. It wasn't a tragic, romantic story. It was a squalid little tale of greed, entitlement, and pathetic male ego. It was the story of a monster who had hidden in plain sight for 50 years, while my family disintegrated in the shadow of his crime. The truth was finally out, and it was uglier than I could have ever imagined. The story of the honeymoon mystery, as the press called it, exploded. For a few weeks, my family's private tragedy became a public spectacle. News vans camped outside my mother's house, and headlines across the country detailed the sordid tale of Arthur Vance, the wealthy industrialist who was, in fact, a common murderer. His trial was swift. Faced with the irrefutable evidence of the film and his own confession, he was found guilty. I sat in the courtroom and watched as he was sentenced to life in prison. a frail, pathetic old man who would now die in a cage of his own making. The gavel fell, and a sense of public justice was served. But for me, it was just noise. The real closure had to happen somewhere quieter. We buried Eleanor and James on a bright sunny autumn day, 50 years late. The funeral was larger than I expected. The few remaining relatives were there, but so were dozens of townspeople, their faces etched with a solemn respect. They were not there for the spectacle. They were there to finally put a local ghost to rest. 2 gleaming wooden caskets sat side by side, and for the first time I wasn't mourning a mystery or a faded photograph. I was mourning my aunt and uncle. As the priest spoke of love and loss, I felt the 50 years of accumulated anger and confusion within me begin to dissolve, replaced by a simple, profound sadness. This was the closure my grandparents never got. This was the closure my mother had prayed for. When it was over, I stood by their graves and felt the sun on my face. The weight that had been on my shoulders my entire life felt noticeably lighter. They were home. A week later, I went to see my mother. I found her in the facility's small, quiet garden, sitting on a bench. It was one of her good days. The fog in her eyes was thin, and she recognized me instantly, a gentle smile gracing her lips. I sat beside her, holding her frail hand in mine, and decided not to tell her about the violence or the betrayal. She didn't need the ugly truth. She needed the peace that had been stolen from her. "Mom," I began softly, "I have something to tell you. It's about Eleanor and James." Her eyes, which had been watching a bird on a branch, sharpened with a focus that startled me. She turned her full attention to me. "We found them," I said, my voice steady. "They've been found. They're at peace now, together. They're buried next to Grandma and Grandpa." I watched her face, holding my breath. She didn't speak. Her eyes searched mine, and then a single, perfect tear welled and slid down her wrinkled cheek. Her hand squeezed mine, a faint but firm pressure. It was a squeeze of acknowledgement, of understanding, of relief. In that silent moment, I saw the burden she had carried for a lifetime finally, gently be set down. The great defining tragedy of her life had found its final chapter. My mission was complete. Tonight, my mother's house is quiet. The boxes are nearly all packed. Soon, it will belong to another family, who will fill its rooms with their own laughter and life. Before I leave for the last time, there is one more thing I have to do. I set up the old projector on the coffee table one last time. I thread the film through the sprockets, but this time I fast forward through the end. I only want to see the beginning. The projector whirs, and the wall flickers to life. There they are. Eleanor, her hair tied in a scarf, waving at the camera. James, skipping a stone across an alpine lake. I watch them, and for the first time, I am not looking for clues. I am not dissecting their expressions or searching for a hint of the darkness to come. I am simply watching my aunt and uncle. The film is no longer an exhibit in a cold case. It's a home movie. It's a memory. It's proof of a love that was real and a life that was lived, however short. A smile touches my lips. The ghosts are gone. In their place are 2 people I feel I have finally gotten to know. The weight is lifted. The story is over. And as the film ends, leaving a warm, bright square of light on the wall, I finally feel at peace.